Leadership. All my life, I've been fascinated by what makes a good leader. Are good leaders born or made? Can leadership be taught? How do leaders lead if people don't trust to even listen? I grew up in Arkansas. Now I live and work in the innovation heartland of Northern California. During these last years of constant crisis, I've thought more deeply about what leadership is and what it takes to lead people, especially when trust is in limited supply. That's why I decided to create this podcast and reach out to changemakers from different disciplines to hear what they have to say. As the host of this show, the most important things I can do are two things I learned in medical school: to ask good questions and then listen. Hello, I'm Lloyd Minor, Dean of the Stanford School of Medicine, and welcome back to the Minor Consult. It's a privilege to welcome this week's guest, the accomplished science author and journalist Carl Zimmer, who might just know how to get people to row in one direction as the world tries in year 3 to put the COVID-19 pandemic behind us. Carl has expanded our concept of life on Earth and the importance of science through his 14 books that include coverage of heredity, evolution, neuroscience, the viruses running rampant on our planet, and even what it means to be alive. His most recent title, Life's Edge, was named a New York Times notable book for 2021 and also appeared on my personal book list of recommended reads. It's my pleasure to introduce a prolific writer and thought leader, Carl Zimmer. Carl, thanks for joining me today. I'd like to start by digging into how you got into your chosen field. You earned your bachelor's in English from Yale in the 1980s. Did you always know you wanted to pursue science communication as a career, or what inspired you?
No, not at all. I mean, I feel very lucky that I kind of backed my way into science writing. I always enjoyed writing when I was young. I'd, write, comic strips or little stories and so on. In college, I, interned at our local newspaper, did various things. So I had hazy ideas of what I would do when I grew up. I always liked science, but I didn't really think that science was for me, so I didn't major in it. I just took classes about science in college because I found it interesting. So it was very fortunate that a couple years out of college, when I was looking for a job at a magazine, it just so happened that the magazine that hired me to be an assistant copy editor was a science magazine, Discover Magazine. And that's where I really started to realize what a fascinating world scientific research was and how much fun it was to write about it.
What do you find most gratifying about the writing that you do and about your profession, and what also is the biggest challenge for you?
Well, I there there's always something new to write about. There's always something that takes you by surprise. There's a scientist somewhere who is just wants to understand the world a little better and comes across something that they didn't anticipate. And when you read about it, you say, "Wait, really?" Um, so there's just an endless amount of fascination in this job. Certainly the challenge then is well, to really understand what a scientist has done, or scientists, and then perhaps the bigger challenge is to actually tell a story about it for a broad audience, for people who haven't done the research and haven't even spent the time that you as a writer have spent trying to understand it. So it's a challenge I can, every day when I sit down at my desk, I still face that challenge.
You grew up in a political family with a father who represented New Jersey in Congress, and it feels like politics has become increasingly balkanized since then. Is this your sense of our current environment? And if so, what's your prediction about the future?
Um, things certainly have changed. I will say. I mean, my father was a Republican congressman. A Republican president set up the EPA. My father was able to talk in Congress about things like global warming and not be considered a heretic. Yeah, so now things are very different, and science has increasingly become, a real battleground for ideology and how people identify themselves. Um, I suppose this is familiar ground for me because when I was starting as a science writer in the 1990s, I really liked writing about evolution. I just found the science fascinating. The research, the fossils people were finding were amazing. Um, and that brought me face to face with with the creationism movement, a very well financed, well organized movement that was trying to get school boards across the country to quote unquote teach the controversy. And so that I feel like that was a bit of a hint of where things would be going. You see a lot of things that happen in terms of the politics of climate change or of the pandemic coming out of the same playbook now.
Yes. Now, 5 years ago, you said something that today feels sadly prescient. You described democracy, science, and journalism as three valuable institutions that have made life far better than it would have been without them. But you also said we can look back through history and see how, in different places and in different times, each of these pillars cracked and sometimes fell. And you went on to say, we should not be so smug when we look back at these episodes. We should not be so arrogant as to believe that we're so much smarter or nobler that somehow we're immune from this. That was 5 years ago. How do you feel about that statement today and about the future?
Well, I said that right when the Trump administration was getting off the ground. And I think that over the course of the Trump administration, we saw such a tremendous attack on scientific integrity. And there's really no other way to put it. Scientists being censored at the Center for Disease Control about the pandemic, the president redrawing a weather map to try to pretend that a hurricane went someplace it didn't go. Um, it unfortunately lived up to my fears, and you know that administration is gone. This current administration is not doing those sorts of things, which is a relief. But I think that I feel like there was some serious damage done, and I am concerned about the long term. And we should look back at um, history and look at how science and journalism and democracy, have been undermined in the past. And if you look at different societies where you had, the early Soviet Union actually had a magnificent scientific system, which people like Lysenko destroyed. In Germany, there was it had a scientific enterprise that was the envy of the world, which then was gradually corrupted in the 1930s with Nazi ideology. Like these things happen, and to somehow pretend that anyone is immune is incredibly presumptuous. We have to be on our guard at all times if we recognize the values of these things.
Long before COVID, you tackled the topic of science denial, once writing that attacks on science are, in a number of cases, well funded campaigns. What did you mean by this, and what can we do or have we done to combat it?
Well, if you look, for example, at when the science of uh, health risks from tobacco started to emerge, tobacco companies put together a very well funded operation to cast doubt on that. And they actually, co opted some scientists and basically just created a lot of doubt. Say, like, well, we're not sure, need some more research and so on. And this was a way to extend the time that they could be making profits off of cigarettes. In other words, killing people. This is all extremely well documented. And you have seen this play out repeatedly, and so for example, with climate change, you would have fossil fuel companies who, themselves were running research in the 1970s and 1980s that clearly demonstrated that putting fossil fuels in the atmosphere was going to cause a global catastrophe. So they saw that, and then they proceeded to fund more efforts to cast doubt on the science of climate change. So we see this again and again, and it's a very dangerous thing, and we those these things need to be exposed, and we need to recognize when science is being corrupted.
What are the similarities and differences between the campaigns that you just talked about and what has been going on with COVID 19?
Well, certainly, certainly, public health has been, a contested ground for a very long time, and so, if we look at just, vaccination and inoculation, even when Boston wanted to get people inoculated against smallpox, there were riots, there were huge demonstrations, and so there there is certainly, authentically, some social conflict about these sorts of decisions about public health in a pandemic. However, when you find that there are wealthy organizations who are systematically, funding uh, uh, you know campaigns to raise doubt about well settled science, or about, or to uh, uh, promote questionable statements about vaccines, for example. Again, you do need to be concerned about what's going on there, and that also, we journalists need to be reporting about those things.
How have you seen the role of journalism change during COVID? Certainly, the data that I read indicate that your own newspaper, the New York Times, I believe subscriptions have gone up significantly. How have you found your readership to be engaged during COVID? And do you think the changes are going to be permanent, or what role will journalists play moving forward compared to in the past as science denialism and other related topics are confronted?
So, I was writing about viruses, about vaccines, about pandemics before COVID, and there were, many of my colleagues were as well. And we were doing it because we felt it was important. But um, I don't think we very often were sort of treated as front page news. And we, at the time, a number of science writers and medical writers, thinking of everyone from Helen Branswell at Stat to Laura Garrett at Foreign Policy. There were just lots of people who were writing about the weaknesses that were present in our public health system that were putting us at risk when a pandemic came. And I and others would write about the inevitability of a pandemic just from what we were coming to understand about viruses. Like, so that scientists were learning about coronaviruses, for example, the SARS outbreak, then the MERS outbreak. Like, it was clear that coronaviruses had the ability to spill over, and there were things that needed to be done about that. And there were scientists at the time who were saying, like, let's develop coronavirus vaccines. Let's develop vaccines that might be effective against any coronavirus. And they would get a little bit of money, and then that money would dry up, and that was it, because coronaviruses just weren't considered important. So suddenly we're here. Suddenly the pandemic comes, and it was very disorienting for us as reporters, because suddenly, um, we were the front page news almost every day, and so it's been hard. And I mean, certainly, I've certainly been writing, much more for the New York Times than I have in the past. Just just there are just weeks where just like many stories just I end up writing. My colleagues as well. I've been writing up a storm. Um, I don't know, I don't, I do wonder what the sort of the long-term impact of this experience will be with all this attention on science journalism, on health journalism during the pandemic. I mean, people want this news, and we're trying to give it to them as best we can. We hope that people will continue to think about these issues um, when things get better. When we're speaking now in February, Omicron cases are going down. I expect that, our spring and summer could be pretty pleasant, honestly. And That's great, but we can't then pretend that the pandemic is gone because the virus is still here and there could be a new variant and so on. So now in the spring and the summer, would be exactly the time that society as a whole should think about, well, what are we going to do? How do we bolster our systems? What do we, if there is a variant fueled surge in the fall or winter, what do we do now to get ready for it? So it would be tragic if all this focus on pandemics and on viruses suddenly went away because we were just tired of it. We were just done with it. That shouldn't be the way we think about it.
You're an adjunct professor at Yale, and in the young people that you teach in your courses and that seek you out for your advice on their careers, are you seeing more interest in journalism and science journalism and how to present science to the public? Are you seeing greater interest in light of the pandemic than you did before? And what in general are your thoughts about the future of science writing and science journalism?
Well, so I teach science and medical writing at Yale, and I always have a mix of students. So some are students who are thinking about becoming journalists or some type of writer. Others are actually science majors and pre-med students who are planning on becoming doctors, and they want to make writing and communicating to the public part of what they do as scientists and as doctors. I think both of those are incredibly valuable, both ways of approaching science. Um, it's honestly, the world of journalism is hurting right now. You know, there are lots of small city newspapers that are on the verge of collapse. There are many news deserts in the United States. It's really tough, and journalists are not getting paid well. So lots of journalists are just walking away, and it's really a tragedy. I mean, I'm grateful that the New York Times is thriving, but it would be absurd to think that a few newspapers like the New York Times could serve the needs of the country as a whole. We need good coverage in St. Louis. We need good coverage in Billings, Montana. We need good coverage everywhere, and that's increasingly disappearing. So, um, I don't want to discourage students too much from that. I want them to be aware of the serious situation. It's still an incredibly valuable thing to do, but it's a tough field to get into, and we need to be thinking about some long-term solutions now that sort of traditional newspaper journalism just isn't working as a business.
Understood. As we contemplate this transition from the pandemic to endemic COVID, what are you thinking about it as you're planning your writings on the topic and the scientists you're talking to? What are the ideas that are percolating up? And you mentioned before about how do we get prepared for what if there is another variant in the fall or the winter? What should we be doing now? What are you learning from those you're talking to and reading that you can convey to us today?
Well, there were some, really valuable lessons that came out of the pandemic that, we would do well to follow up on. So, for example, it, it was we actually now have a drug from Paxlovid from Pfizer, which actually is extremely effective. And appears to have very few side effects. You do have to be cautious about drug interactions, but um, and what's amazing about that was that was pretty much started from scratch at the start of the pandemic. That kind of drug development is extraordinary. That's incredibly fast. So how did they do that? Well, they got to know this virus really well on a molecular level, and they just focused intently on developing a drug. Now, that's not enough, because there will probably be Paxlovid resistance sooner or later, and we will probably be even better off with a cocktail of drugs, and maybe we can bring this approach to other kinds of viruses that might lead to new pandemics. What about a filovirus or something like that? So, but you need programs in place for that to happen. I mean, you can't. We don't want to just sit around and wait for the next pandemic to happen and then respond to that pandemic by inventing a drug in record time. I mean, Paxlovid was really invented in record time when you look at similar drugs like that. But I mean, think of all the millions of people who died by the time it got through. So it is interesting, like talking to scientists who are trying to really seriously think ahead to the next pandemic and do the work now for antivirals, for vaccines as well. It was amazing that vaccines were created and then authorized within a year of a pandemic. But again, that's a year. So how could we have vaccines at the ready? Could we have vaccines that are actually effective against a wide range of coronaviruses? There's scattered research going on that now. It's not very well organized, honestly, but that's an important area as well that scientists are talking about.
One thing I've admired about your writing over the years is your ability to take complicated scientific concepts, to distill them, and then to present them in a narrative, in a story that's compelling, that's understandable, that also is rigorously scientifically accurate. And I'm wondering, are there particular topics or areas that are more challenging than others for you to write about or convey? And you've covered the whole gamut, Carl. You've talked about complicated statistical concepts. You've covered the intricacies of viruses and a passion, as you described, of yours over the years, evolution, and now the genomic components of evolution and what genomics is teaching us about evolution. So you've covered broad scientific landscape. And I was just curious if there's one area that's more difficult than the others, or one area that you feel more passionate about, and how that influences the topics you choose to write about.
When I was starting out as a science writer, so I was at Discover Magazine, and when you're an assistant editor there, you don't really get to be very fussy about what you write about. You just write about what your editor tells you to write about, and that was good in the sense that like I had to write about a wide range of fields, and so you do learn how to like figure things out quickly, how to kind of help scientists to get scientists to help you understand what the gist is of what they're doing. Um, because you can write about things without like having an advanced degree in that subject, as long as you are trying to really understand the basics of it in a meaningful way. Um, that also meant that I got to try out a lot of different areas. So I was actually drawn to evolution and sort of natural history, and I sort of see viruses in medicine as sort of an extension of that. Um, I did write about physics and about math as well early on. I found those to be really hard, and the hardest thing was just that there was just I really struggled to find ways to connect what made sense, in a series of equations into language, into metaphors, into things that people could really understand. And so I would shy away from those sorts of stories myself, and I'm always very impressed by people say like Sean Carroll at Caltech, who are just so good at getting into the complexities of you know quarks and protons and so on, or superstring theory or what have you, and can really like share that excitement in that rigorous way. Um, but fortunately, there's no end of stuff to write about in biology, so I'm fine.
And I think you will be for many years to come, given the overall interest in biology and life sciences and the importance. What do you think will be the enduring lessons as we move, hopefully sooner rather than later, from a pandemic phase to an endemic phase for COVID? What will be the enduring lessons for society coming out of the pandemic?
um, well, I think that I hope that people will recognize that pandemics are not a theoretical risk. Again, there have been scientists warning about exactly the sort of thing happening for 20 or 30 years. And it was hard to really get a lot of focus on it just because it kind of felt like an asteroid, hitting the Earth. Yeah, we know asteroids have hit the Earth in the past, but that's not really going to happen, right? So it's happened. We've had our medical asteroid hit, and I just hope that people recognize that there are a lot of more asteroids floating around out there, and it's not just the scientific uh, infrastructure that needs to be strengthened to work on vaccines and antivirals and such. We also need public health systems to be strong. Um, we you can't have a totally new disease sweep through and have understaffed hospitals where people don't have the equipment they need to stay safe. That should never happen again. And we need for surveillance. It's all well and good for a small, wealthy, university-focused country like Denmark to be really good at tracking all the variants that they're encountering. Um, that needs to be in place everywhere. We have huge parts of the world right now where we know that the coronavirus is replicating, and nobody really knows what variants are out there. So with the Omicron variant, we scientists in South Africa came across it, and as well as Botswana, they came across it because they had a good sort of random sampling system in place. That if you go to other parts of Africa, Asia, and South America, like that doesn't exist. Even the United States, our system is not very good. So these are all the things I hope going forward that we take as lessons from this pandemic. There were a lot of things we could have done. We had some great successes. We need to replicate those successes, and there are a lot of things that we really failed on, and we need to do better on. For future pandemics, but also for this one. I mean, like we're not out of this pandemic. People keep talking about, oh, we're going to be endemic soon, and I just don't
Yeah,
buy that. And how are we going to know when that next SARS-CoV-2 variant is coming?
exactly.
We'll know it if we have global, really good variant monitoring, and we don't have that right now.
Do you see progress in that regard? You described some
I see
areas
some.
where
I
there
see.
has been progress, but how far away are we from having the type of monitoring that you just so eloquently described?
I'd say there's been modest progress. So in the United States, for example, uh, things have ramped up. So things are better now. I wrote a very critical article in the New York Times when the first variant Alpha showed up, in January 2021 in the United States, and all these scientists are saying like we are flying blind. We this thing is here. We don't know exactly where it is. We don't know how fast it's growing. We need systems in place. And the Biden administration did put in a few $1 billion of investment, and so things are better in the United States, but they could still be better. And not only that, but we just this needs to be global. And it's not that expensive. That's a frustrating thing. I mean, it's amazing that that scientists can sequence viruses. It's a scientific triumph. And what's even more amazing is it's not that expensive to do it. So you can set up these systems pretty inexpensively, but it takes organization and it takes leadership. And so, in South Africa and Botswana, like they've got their systems going, and it doesn't cost them that much. That could be replicated in every country. It really could. But it would just take efforts. Now, the Rockefeller Foundation and other organizations are trying to make global systems, trying to encourage global systems to be put in place, but they're not there yet.
Understood. What are the most important attributes of leadership in a crisis, and how do leaders need to communicate differently in a crisis than when it's not a crisis?
Um, you know, I um, It's an interesting question. I mean, I suppose, my responses would not be based on like precise science. It would have to be more kind of intuition. Um, it does seem, having watched the pandemic play out, that people people need honesty. In other words, there was a CDC official in February 2020 who said, like, this is going to get bad, and she was promptly never heard from again. Um, eh, that kind of She was completely right. She knew she was right at the time. In hindsight, you could see she was right. So people needed to know that things were going to be bad, but not to feel helpless. Like there were things that we could do. Um, and so if, so there needs to be leadership that sort of gets beyond being scared about making people upset. Um, Leadership also involves communication, in the sense of being able to communicate what science knows at that moment. This is a challenge, I think, that leaders have whenever science comes into play, because I think a lot of people think that science is somehow deals in absolutes, so that scientists know things to be absolutely correct, and once they know that, nothing ever changes. Whereas, science is always about trying to come up with the best explanation that we can at this moment. Given the evidence we have, given the tools we have to understand things, it's a status report. And that can change. And there can be like legitimate scientific debates about the evidence at hand. So, there was a serious debate about the effectiveness of masks in early 2020. There were a lot of different factors there. Um, and then things evolved, and so that advice about masks became firmer and firmer. Now, some people said, like, oh well, you lied to us about masks. So leaders need to be able to help people to understand the nature of the evidence that they're looking at, and how they're making these policy decisions, and just prepare people for changes. That's hard. That's very hard. And people just want things on and off. And we're honestly, I think we're at a point now where leadership has to can't I feel like leaders, like governors and so on, just want to put COVID behind them. um, just say, oh, no one needs masks anymore, like, it's fine. And like, that is just not the right kind of advice. I mean, first of all, our cases are still, relatively speaking, very high. They're coming down, but they're high. And you have to be thinking ahead to this fall. Like, what is going to happen this fall? Like, how are you going to use policy to save lives this fall if we're dealing with a new variant that is evading vaccines, that is maybe more severe than Omicron? Like, what are you going to do? That's going to take some real leadership.
Absolutely. How could scientists do a better job at communicating uncertainty? You just gave a very eloquent description of the scientific method and what we actually do as scientists and what we don't do. And in general, we're trying to establish the truths based upon the evidence and the data we have at the time, but that oftentimes changes in the future. But I have a sense at times we don't do as good of a job as we can and should in communicating the level of uncertainty with which we work as scientists. You help us as a journalist to do that, but how can we be more effective?
Well, um, I, I, I wouldn't. I don't think scientists should put pressure on themselves that somehow they should immediately, like instantly, be able to communicate effectively about complicated things. Just overnight.
Sure.
It's a little bit like saying like, I'd really like to play the trombone. So what do I do to play the trombone? I mean, and it's like, well, okay, I can tell you like, well, you blow into this thing and you move the valves around, like, but like you're not going to just be able to like read the instructions and start playing a trombone, at least not very well at first. It takes time.
Mhm.
It takes time. It takes practice. It takes training, and scientists in training, science majors in undergraduate college or graduate students in science, they do not get trained in how to communicate to a wide audience. Maybe they get a little bit of training about how to write a scientific paper, which is not writing for a wide audience. Maybe they get given a few tips about how to speak at a scientific conference, not talking to the public. So you know, I think the question, I would redirect the question to say like, what can the scientific community do to better prepare its young scientists
Yep.
for this challenge? And I would say, get have people doing this repeatedly. You know, like when I teach a workshop for science graduate students at Yale, and I say like, okay, pick out any paper and explain it to me. Tell me the story about this paper in 600 or 700 words. And like a lot of times, I just don't. They try their best, and their first attempt, I just don't know what they're talking about. It's unreadable. And I don't. But I again, like it's not. I'm not condemning them for
Sure.
that. It's just that this may be the very first time someone ever asked them to do that.
Understood. Well, you're doing them and I think the entire scientific community a service by those types of sessions and educational endeavors. I have to ask a question. I understand there's a tapeworm named after you. Could you give us the story on that? How did that come about? And yeah, tell me more.
Sure, it's a Acanthobothrium zimmeri, and it's a little tape. People think of tapeworms as being really long, but there are a lot of little ones. This one is one that lives in a relative of sharks in the Pacific, and so I wrote a book about parasites called Parasite Rex, and it's a very creepy and gross book, but it's also a very strong argument that I try to make that parasites have been neglected and have been underappreciated. That parasites have actually won the game of evolution. There are far more species of parasites on Earth than free living species. They're incredibly sophisticated. They're not degenerates. They are really remarkable, and we can learn things from parasites. So, and so there have been, a few, practicing parasitologists who have told me that, they read that book in high school or in college, and that sort of gave them permission to turn their fascination with parasites into a career. And so there was one graduate student who had enjoyed reading my book, and then when it came time to name some tapeworms that she was doing for a PhD, she ended up naming one after me. It's it's not, it's fun to have a species named after me, but honestly, like there may be, I think in the last estimate there might be 30 or 40,000 of species of tapeworms left to be described. There are a lot of tapeworms out there. So, once we get to name all the tapeworms on Earth, like it'll be much less of a special honor.
These have been challenging times for everyone the past 2+ years, and you've been at the forefront and enlightening us, Carl, keeping us informed, and through your brilliant writing, helping us understand what's going on. What gives you most hope for the future? And I guess in general, how are you feeling about the future?
I think, I don't think that we can afford to be complete pessimists. I think we have to be optimists or things aren't going to get better. I, with this pandemic, obviously this is the thing that really like stands in front of us as the major challenge of our time. And, we have certainly been able to see things that we can do to be ready to better address this pandemic and to address pandemics to come. So I feel optimistic in the sense that like I think we know some of the things we need to do. So now we just need to do them, which is not a small thing. It's going to take a lot of political will. It's going to take a lot of organization and focus, sustained focus. Unfortunately, as a science writer, starting in the 1990s, I was, like other science writers, I was writing about climate change. And honestly, like, the science of climate change was, the basics were very clear then. And we were writing about how scientists were understanding climate, how the climate works, and we're trying to look forward to figure out what was going to happen if we kept emitting fossil fuels. Now we're starting to live that future. And so that, that is really disheartening. And, we've sort of baked in a lot more climate change now because we're not shifting fast enough away from fossil fuels. On the other hand, I never would have imagined that, the price of solar panels or would it be getting so cheap. Electric vehicles are about to cross over, and we could be looking at electric vehicles as being dominant soon, and that's amazing. And so those things give me some hope. We have to figure out how to avoid pandemics in the future. We have to figure out how to save the planet from a sixth mass extinction, and we have to put the brakes on climate change. Those are I would say are like, three of the major science-related challenges that our species faces. I think we can meet all of them, but it's going to take commitment.
Absolutely. Well, Carl, thank you very much, and thank you for listening to this enlightening discussion with acclaimed writer and journalist Carl Zimmer. If you haven't already, I encourage you to check out our other Minor Consult podcasts with guests like historian John Berry, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, and film producer Jennifer Todd. And as always, I'd love to hear from you. Please send your questions by email to theminorconsult@theminorconsult.com, and be sure to check out our website, theminorconsult.com, for updates, episodes, and more. To get the latest episodes of The Minor Consult, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate the podcast 5 stars. Your feedback helps make this podcast happen. Thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to our next episode. Until then, stay safe, stay well, and be kind.